You won't leave this house alive, Mama. Those words still echo in my mind every single night. 6 words that shattered everything I thought I knew about love, about family, about the child I brought into this world with my own blood and tears. My own son, Daniel, the boy I carried for 9 months, the baby I nursed through countless sleepless nights, the child I raised alone after his father died, stood there in my living room holding a silver lighter, his face as cold and emotionless as winter stone. I watched the flame dance in his dark eyes, those same eyes that used to look up at me with wonder when I read him bedtime stories. Now they held nothing but calculation, nothing but greed. The curtains caught fire first, the yellow ones I had sewn myself, the ones that had filtered morning sunlight into his childhood bedroom for 17 years. The fabric hissed and crackled as the flames climbed toward the ceiling, and I could feel the heat against my face, smell the acrid smoke filling my lungs. The walls began to groan under the growing inferno, wood expanding and splitting as the fire spread with hungry determination. And as I stood there, frozen in disbelief, I caught my reflection in his eyes. But I wasn't seeing myself as his mother anymore. I wasn't the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a good life. In his gaze, I was nothing more than an obstacle, a problem to be eliminated, a life standing between him and whatever he thought he deserved. But here's what my son didn't know that night. Here's what he couldn't have predicted as he walked away from our burning home, leaving me to die in the flames he had set. I wasn't going to die that night. Not before the truth burned brighter than his fire. Not before justice found its way through the smoke and ash. Because sometimes, when you think you're destroying everything, you're actually revealing what was hidden all along. Before I tell you what happened next, before I share the truth that changed everything, I need you to know something. Your support means everything to stories like this one. Stories that need to be told, that need to be heard. So if this reaches you, if these words find their way to your heart, please subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because every voice matters and every story deserves to live. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. Let me tell you about fire and how I learned its language long before my son ever thought to use it against me. I was 9 years old when I first met fire. Really met it, I mean. Not just the gentle flames of birthday candles or the cozy warmth of our fireplace during winter evenings. I'm talking about real fire, the kind that demands respect, the kind that can save you or destroy you depending on how you approach it. My mother, God rest her soul, was the one who taught me. We were camping in the mountains, just the two of us, when a sudden storm rolled in. The rain was coming down in sheets, and our tent was leaking. Everything was soaked, our clothes, our sleeping bags, our food. I was shivering so hard my teeth were chattering, and I was starting to panic because I thought we might freeze to death out there in the wilderness. But my mother, she just calmly gathered some dry wood she had stored under a tarp. She built a fire in the rain, her hands steady and sure, never rushing, never doubting. As the flames caught and grew, pushing back the cold and the darkness, she looked at me with those wise eyes and said something I would never forget. Fire only listens to those who respect it, baby girl. It can be your greatest ally or your worst enemy. The choice is always yours. I held on to those words through every difficult moment of my life, through losing my father when I was 16, through meeting and marrying my husband, James, through the joy of bringing Daniel into this world, and through the devastating grief of losing James when Daniel was only 7 years old. After my husband died, I tried to pass that same lesson on to my son. I tried to teach him about respect, about the power that comes with understanding rather than domination. Daniel was brilliant. There was no denying that. His mind worked faster than most adults, and he could solve problems that left me scratching my head. But brilliance without wisdom is dangerous. Intelligence without compassion is a weapon waiting to be used. He was restless, always restless. Even as a small child, he couldn't sit still, couldn't accept simple answers, couldn't trust that love was enough. He was the kind of boy who tested every boundary, who questioned every rule, who seemed to believe that warmth and affection were signs of weakness rather than strength. I thought it was just a phase. I thought that with enough patience, enough love, enough understanding, I could help him find his way. I thought that being a single mother meant I had to work twice as hard to show him what strength really looked like. So I did everything I could to give him opportunities, to surround him with good influences, to help him channel his restless energy into something positive. But everything changed when the money came into our lives. James had left us a modest life insurance policy, enough to pay off the house and put some aside for Daniel's education. It wasn't a fortune, but it was security. It was the kind of financial stability that should have brought peace to our little family. Instead, it brought out something dark in my son, something I had hoped was just teenage rebellion, but was actually much deeper, much more dangerous. The money didn't make him grateful. It made him hungry. It didn't make him feel secure. It made him feel entitled. And it didn't bring us closer together. It created a distance between us that seemed to grow wider every day. He stopped wanting simple pleasures. He stopped appreciating the warmth of our home, the comfort of our routines, the quiet joy of our conversations over dinner. Instead, he wanted things, expensive things, impressive things, things that would make him look important to people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered to a 16-year-old boy. But more than that, he wanted control. He wanted to make decisions about our finances, about our future, about our life together. He started talking about investments and business opportunities with a sophistication that felt unnatural coming from someone so young. He began questioning every purchase I made, every decision I made, as if my judgment couldn't be trusted anymore. The warmth between us started to fade. Where there had once been easy laughter and comfortable silences, now there were cold dinners and unanswered questions. He would come home from school and disappear into his room without a word. He would avoid my eyes when I tried to talk to him about his day. He would respond to my attempts at connection with one-word answers and heavy sighs. I told myself it was normal teenage behavior. I told myself that all kids pull away from their parents as they grow up, that independence meant he was developing normally. But deep in my heart, I knew this was different. This felt deliberate. This felt like rejection. The distance I felt from Daniel was just the beginning. What came next would test everything I thought I knew about my own son, and everything I thought I understood about the family I had tried so hard to build and protect. I should have paid more attention to the signs. I should have trusted my instincts when things started feeling wrong in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. But when you love someone, when you've invested your whole heart in believing the best about them, it's easy to explain away the small things that don't make sense. It's easy to tell yourself that you're being paranoid, that you're looking for problems where none exist. The changes started small. Cold dinners that Daniel would barely touch, claiming he wasn't hungry even though I had made his favorite meals. Phone calls that went unanswered, even when I knew he was home and his phone was right there beside him. Conversations that felt forced and artificial, like he was performing the role of my son rather than actually being present with me. But then I started noticing documents, papers scattered across his desk that he would quickly shuffle away when I entered his room, bank statements that didn't look familiar, with account numbers I didn't recognize, legal documents with letterheads from law firms I had never heard of. When I asked him about them, he would brush off my questions with vague answers about school projects or research that never quite made sense. The money I had carefully budgeted and saved started moving in ways I couldn't track. Small amounts at first, $50 here, 100 there, that Daniel claimed were for school expenses or activities with friends. But then larger amounts began disappearing, and when I questioned him about it, he would get defensive and angry, accusing me of not trusting him, of treating him like a child. "I'm almost 18, Mom," he would say, his voice cold and cutting. "I'm not a baby anymore. I can handle money responsibly." But responsibility wasn't what I was seeing. What I was seeing was secretiveness. What I was seeing was deception. What I was seeing was my son slowly but systematically taking control of resources that were meant to secure our future together. And then she appeared, Daniel's new girlfriend, though he never officially introduced her to me as such. Her name was Vanessa, and she was unlike any of the girls he had dated before. She was older, for one thing, at least 25, maybe older, with the kind of sophisticated confidence that comes from experience in the world that my 17-year-old son simply couldn't have. She was charming, I'll give her that. Beautiful in a polished, calculated way. Always perfectly dressed, always saying exactly the right thing to everyone she met. When she spoke to me, she was respectful and sweet, asking about my day, complimenting my cooking, showing interest in family photos and stories about Daniel's childhood. But there was something underneath all that charm that made my skin crawl. Something in the way her eyes would go cold when she thought I wasn't looking. Something in the way she would touch Daniel's arm when she wanted his attention, possessive and controlling. Something in the way she seemed to study our home, our belongings, our routines, like she was taking inventory. She started spending more and more time at our house, often staying for dinner, sometimes sleeping over in Daniel's room. I wanted to object. He was still my minor child, living under my roof. But every time I tried to establish boundaries, Daniel would explode with rage about how I was trying to control his life, how I didn't respect his choices, how I was being unreasonable and old-fashioned. Vanessa would always play peacemaker in these moments, gently suggesting that maybe we could find a compromise, that surely we could all get along if we just communicated better. But I could see the satisfaction in her eyes when Daniel fought with me. I could see how she encouraged his anger, how she fed his resentment, how she positioned herself as the understanding ally while painting me as the unreasonable obstacle. They would whisper together in corners of the house, their heads bent close over documents or phone screens, their voices too low for me to hear, but their body language tense with secrecy. They would move money I didn't recognize. I would catch glimpses of bank transfers on Daniel's laptop, numbers that were far larger than anything our family had ever dealt with. And when I asked questions, they would both look at me like I was being paranoid, like I was inventing problems that didn't exist. But the worst part was how they smiled. God, how they smiled, especially when I would cough. I had developed a persistent cough that winter. Nothing serious, just a chest cold that seemed to linger longer than usual. But every time I would have a coughing fit, I would catch them exchanging these looks, these satisfied, anticipatory looks, like they were waiting for something, like they were hoping for something. One evening in late March, I was coming back from the kitchen when I heard Vanessa's voice drifting from Daniel's room. The door was slightly ajar, and her words cut through the quiet house like a knife through my heart. "When she's gone, everything's ours," she said, her voice soft but unmistakably calculating. "The house, the insurance money, everything your father left. We just have to be patient a little longer." I stood frozen in the hallway, my blood turning to ice in my veins. My own son's voice responded, though I couldn't make out his exact words. But his tone was agreeable, complicit, like they were discussing what to have for dinner rather than the end of my life. That's when I knew. That's when the last piece of denial crumbled away, and I was forced to face the truth that my son, my baby, my only child, was planning to kill me. They were planning to kill me and take everything I had worked for, everything James had left for our family's future. But here's what they didn't understand about me. Here's what they had miscalculated in all their careful planning. I might have been a single mother. I might have been trusting. I might have been willing to believe the best about people I loved. But I wasn't weak, and I wasn't stupid. That night, after they fell asleep, I began to write. Not a will. Wills could be contested, could be challenged, could be manipulated by people with expensive lawyers and flexible ethics. I began writing a confession, a detailed account of everything I had observed, everything I had overheard, everything I suspected about their plans. I documented the missing money, the suspicious documents, the secretive conversations. I wrote down dates and times and specific details that would be impossible to dismiss as the paranoid fantasies of a sick woman. I described Vanessa's background as far as I could research it, including some financial irregularities I had discovered in her past. I outlined the timeline of Daniel's changing behavior and the correlation with her appearance in our lives. But most importantly, I began investigating my own family's history. James had always been secretive about certain aspects of his past, not in a way that seemed dangerous or deceptive, just private. But if I was going to protect myself, if I was going to fight back against my son's betrayal, I needed to understand everything about our family's assets and history. I started going through James's old papers, documents I had packed away after his death because they were too painful to deal with at the time. Legal documents and property deeds and financial records that I had trusted him to handle during our marriage. What I found would change everything. What I found would give me the weapon I needed to fight back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the night Daniel tried to kill me. Let me tell you about the fire that was supposed to end my life, but instead became the beginning of my revenge. It was a Tuesday night in April. I remember because I had been planning to start my garden that weekend, and I was looking forward to working in the soil, to creating something beautiful and alive. Daniel had been unusually quiet all day, almost nervous. Vanessa hadn't been around, which was unusual. She had been practically living at our house for months. After dinner, Daniel disappeared into his room for what felt like hours. I could hear him moving around, but when I knocked to ask if he needed anything, he told me he was fine, just working on homework. His voice sounded strange, though, strained, like he was trying to appear normal when everything inside him was wound tight. Around 10 o'clock, I was getting ready for bed when I heard him come out of his room. I called out good night, but he didn't respond. Instead, I heard his footsteps moving around the house in a pattern that didn't make sense. He seemed to be going from room to room, but not in any normal way. He was being quiet, deliberate, like he was checking something or setting something up. I put on my robe and went to find him, thinking maybe he was having trouble sleeping or needed to talk. But when I found him in the living room, everything about his posture and expression told me that this was the moment I had been dreading. He was standing by the fireplace, and he had that silver lighter in his hand, not a cheap plastic one, an expensive engraved lighter that I had never seen before. His face was set in hard lines, like he had spent hours practicing this expression in the mirror. When he looked at me, there was no recognition of our relationship in his eyes, no acknowledgement of our history together, no trace of the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. "You won't leave this house alive, Mama," he said, and his voice was so cold, so final, that I knew he had been planning these exact words. He had been rehearsing this moment, preparing for it, building up to it. The lighter sparked, and the flame seemed to illuminate something evil in his face. He walked over to the curtains, those yellow curtains I had made with such care, and held the flame to the fabric. The fire caught immediately, racing up toward the ceiling with a hungry roar. I stood there watching my son commit murder, watching him try to kill his own mother for money. The heat hit my face like a physical blow, and the smoke began to fill my lungs, making me cough even harder than I had been coughing all winter. The walls began to groan and crack as the fire spread, and I could hear windows beginning to shatter from the heat. Daniel watched me for a moment, making sure the fire was spreading fast enough, making sure I wouldn't be able to escape. Then he walked to the front door, and I heard the sound that still haunts my dreams, the sound of the deadbolt turning from the outside. He had locked me in with the fire. He had made sure I would burn alive. But here's what my son didn't know. Here's what he couldn't have anticipated as he walked away from our burning house, probably already calling Vanessa to tell her it was done. I had been expecting this night for weeks. Ever since I had overheard their conversation, I had been preparing. Under my nightgown, wrapped in a waterproof cloth and secured against my body, I carried a flash drive that contained everything I had discovered about our family's real history. Everything I had learned about James's past that Daniel had never known about. Fire was his weapon, but truth was mine. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. Instead, I did what my mother had taught me all those years ago. I respected the fire. I understood its patterns, its behavior, its weaknesses. I knew that fire rises, so I stayed low. I knew that fire needs oxygen, so I found the bathroom where the ventilation was different. I knew that fire takes time to consume everything, so I waited. I wrapped wet towels around my body and stayed in the bathtub, breathing through damp cloth, while my childhood home burned around me. I listened to the structure collapsing, to my belongings being destroyed, to my past being erased. But I stayed alive. I stayed conscious. And I protected that flash drive like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. The fire department arrived eventually. Neighbors had seen the flames and called for help. By the time they pulled me from the wreckage, the house was gone. Everything I had owned, every memory I had collected, every physical reminder of my life with James and my early years with Daniel, all of it was ash. The paramedics wanted to take me to the hospital, but I refused. I told them I was fine, that I just needed to stay with friends for a few days while I figured out what to do next. Daniel, of course, was nowhere to be found. When the investigators asked about him, I told them he had been staying with friends, that he was probably worried sick when he heard about the fire. I played the role of the grieving mother who had lost everything. And in a way, that's exactly what I was. But I wasn't done fighting. 3 weeks after the fire, when the investigators had finished their work and the insurance adjusters had completed their reports, I returned to the ruins of my home, The frame was gone, the roof had collapsed, and everything I could see was blackened and destroyed. But I wasn't looking at the surface. I was looking for what lay beneath. James had been a careful man, a man who planned for possibilities that other people never considered. During our marriage, I had always assumed that his caution came from losing his own father at a young age. He wanted to make sure our family would be secure no matter what happened to him. But in the weeks before the fire, while I was researching our family's documents, I had discovered that James's caution went much deeper than I had ever realized. He had been protecting secrets, and he had hidden things that even I didn't know about. The concrete foundation of our house was cracked and broken from the heat, but it was still there, and in the corner of what had been our basement, under a section of floor that had collapsed, I found what I was looking for: a metal chest buried 3 feet underground, protected by layers of concrete and steel that the fire couldn't touch. My hands were shaking as I dug through the debris and ash. This was what James had been hiding. This was what he had never told me about. This was the secret that would change everything. Inside the chest, I found documents that took my breath away. Property deeds for land I had never heard of, bank account information for assets I didn't know existed, legal papers establishing trusts, and inheritance rights that went back generations. But most importantly, I found a photograph, a picture of James as a young man standing beside a woman I had never seen before, holding a baby that wasn't Daniel. And underneath the photograph, there was a letter in James's handwriting that began, "If this reaches you, it means fire has come again." My hands were trembling as I read the letter that my dead husband had written to me, somehow knowing that someday I would need it, somehow knowing that truth would be my only weapon against the betrayal that was coming. The letter told me about James's first marriage, which had ended in divorce long before I met him. It told me about his first son, a boy named Michael who was now 28 years old and living in California, completely unaware that his father had died. It told me about property and assets that legally belonged to Michael as the eldest heir, assets that Daniel had been planning to inherit. But most importantly, it told me about Vanessa. James had recognized her immediately when Daniel first brought her around, though he had never said anything to me about it. Her real name was Victoria Brennan, and she was a con artist who specialized in targeting families with recent inheritances. She had been involved in at least 3 other cases where elderly family members had died under suspicious circumstances shortly after she entered their lives. James had been trying to gather evidence against her when he died. His death, which I had always assumed was a heart attack brought on by stress and poor health, might not have been natural at all. The letter ended with instructions for how to contact Michael, and with a plea that I use this information to protect our family's legacy from people who would destroy it for their own gain. I sat there in the ashes of my burned home, holding the photograph of my husband's first son, and I realized that everything Daniel thought he knew about our family was wrong. Everything he thought he was entitled to legally belonged to someone else, and everything Vanessa had planned was about to crumble around her. I had spent weeks playing the role of the helpless victim. Now it was time to become something else entirely. I didn't call the police immediately. I didn't contact lawyers or investigators or anyone in authority. Instead, I drove home to the small apartment I had been renting since the fire, and I made a phone call to California. "Hello, is this Michael Harrison?" I asked when a man's voice answered. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Margaret Harrison. I was married to your father, James. I think it's time you and I had a conversation about your inheritance." 2 days later, Michael was on a plane to see me, and a week after that, Daniel came home. I was waiting for him in my small apartment, sitting calmly at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. I had been expecting him to show up eventually. He would need to check on his investment, need to see how his plan had worked out, need to start the process of claiming his inheritance. He knocked on the door like a dutiful son coming to check on his mother after a tragedy. When I opened it, his face was arranged in an expression of concern and sorrow that might have fooled anyone who didn't know better. "Mom," he said, reaching out to hug me, "I'm so sorry about the house. I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay? Where have you been staying?" I stepped back from his embrace and looked into his eyes, the same eyes that had reflected flames as he tried to kill me. "Come in, Daniel. We need to talk." He followed me into the small living room, still playing his role, still pretending to be the loving son who was worried about his mother's welfare. He sat down across from me and leaned forward with fake concern. "I've been so worried about you," he said. "When I heard about the fire, I thought I was so scared that you might have been hurt. Thank God you got out safely." I studied his face for a long moment, marveling at how convincing he could be when he wanted something, how easily he could lie, how completely he could deceive even the person who had loved him most in the world. "Do you believe in ghosts, Daniel?" I asked quietly. He frowned, clearly not expecting that question. "What? No, of course not. Why would you ask me that?" I reached into the folder beside my chair and pulled out the letter from his father, the letter he had never seen, had never known existed, the letter that would destroy everything he thought he understood about his future. "You should," I whispered, holding out the pages to him. "Because your father just wrote to both of us." I watched the color drain from his face as he read. I watched his hands begin to shake as he realized what he was looking at. I watched his eyes widen with panic as he understood that everything he had planned, everything he had done, had been for nothing. The property he thought he would inherit legally belonged to his older half-brother. The money he thought he could access was tied up in trusts that required the consent of both heirs. The life insurance policy he thought would make him rich would be contested and likely overturned once Michael's existence became known to the courts. But more than that, I watched him realize that I knew. I knew what he had done. I knew why he had done it. I knew about Vanessa and her real identity and their plans for my death. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father hid it for me to find," I said calmly. He knew that someday I would need it. He knew that someday someone would try to use fire against our family, and he wanted to make sure I had the tools to fight back. For the first time since he was a small child, I saw real fear in my son's eyes. Not the fear of getting in trouble or being punished, but the fear of someone who had just realized that all of their careful planning had been built on lies. "I've already contacted Michael," I continued, my voice steady and controlled. "He's on his way here. We've already spoken with lawyers. The papers have already been filed with the court." Daniel's face went through a dozen different expressions: panic, anger, calculation, desperation. I could see him trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, how to turn this new information to his advantage. "Mom," he said finally, his voice taking on a pleading tone I hadn't heard since he was 7 years old. "Whatever you think happened, whatever you think I did, we can work this out. We're family. We can figure this out together." I looked at him for a long moment, this young man who had once been my baby, my little boy, my greatest joy and proudest accomplishment. I thought about all the nights I had stayed up with him when he was sick, all the times I had cheered for him at school events, all the sacrifices I had made to give him opportunities and advantages. And then I thought about standing in my burning home, locked inside by my own child, waiting to die so that he could profit from my death. Family doesn't try to murder each other for money, Daniel, I said quietly. Family doesn't lock their mother inside a burning house and walk away. His face went completely white. For a moment, I thought he might try to deny it, might try to convince me that I was imagining things or misremembering what had happened. But even Daniel wasn't that good a liar. Instead, he broke down. He started crying, sobbing like the child he had once been, begging me to forgive him, telling me that it had all been Vanessa's idea, that she had manipulated him and convinced him that I was holding him back from his potential. I never wanted to hurt you, he cried. I just wanted to be free. I wanted to have choices. She told me that you would never let me grow up, that you would always try to control me. She said that if I didn't take control of my own life, I would end up trapped forever. I listened to his excuses and his justifications and his attempts to shift the blame. I listened to him try to make me feel sorry for him, try to make me believe that he was as much a victim as I was. But I had moved beyond forgiveness. I had moved beyond the need to understand or excuse or rationalize. I had been tested by fire, and I had survived. Now it was time for justice. I didn't take him to court. I didn't call the police or press charges or try to have him arrested for attempted murder. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because I had found a better way to make sure he faced the consequences of his choices. I simply let the legal system do what it was designed to do. Within 2 weeks, Michael's lawyers had filed all the necessary paperwork to establish his rightful claim to his father's estate. Within a month, every asset that Daniel thought he would inherit had been legally transferred to his older brother. The house insurance money went into a trust that would be administered by Michael. The land that James had owned went to Michael. The bank accounts and investments and everything else that represented our family's financial security. It all went to the son who had never tried to kill his stepmother for money. Daniel and Vanessa found themselves with nothing. All their planning, all their manipulation, all their careful scheming had resulted in them being exactly where they had started, with no money, no property, and no prospects. But I wasn't done yet. I also made sure that the authorities in 3 different states knew about Victoria Brennan and her pattern of targeting vulnerable families. I provided them with everything James had gathered about her background, plus everything I had discovered about her current activities. Within 6 months, she was arrested for fraud and suspected murder in connection with the deaths of 2 elderly men whose families she had infiltrated. Daniel was questioned as a potential accomplice, though ultimately he wasn't charged with any crimes related to her other victims. But he was charged with arson and attempted murder in connection with the fire that destroyed our home. The evidence was overwhelming. The investigators found traces of accelerant that matched the lighter fluid he had used. They found his fingerprints on the deadbolt that had been used to lock me inside. They found text messages between him and Vanessa discussing their plans for after I was gone. Most importantly, they found neighbors who had seen him leaving the house just minutes before the fire started. Neighbors who had thought it was strange that he would leave his mother alone in a burning house. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The fire that was supposed to kill me had instead revealed the truth about everything. It had exposed Daniel's true nature. It had uncovered James's secrets. It had brought Michael into our family where he belonged. And it had destroyed the people who thought they could profit from my death. Justice came quietly, not through revenge or anger or violence, but through the simple power of truth to burn away lies and reveal what was real. When people drive past my new home now, the modest house I was able to buy with my portion of James's estate. They can still see the burn marks on the metal gate that I had installed. Burn marks from the night Daniel tried to kill me. Burn marks that I could have cleaned or painted over or replaced. But I never did. I left them there deliberately, as a reminder, not a reminder of hatred or bitterness, or the desire for revenge, but a reminder that not all fire destroys. Some fire reveals, some fire purifies, some fire burns away what is false and leaves only what is true. My son left town the day he was released on bail, before his trial even began. He couldn't face the neighbors who knew what he had done. He couldn't face the community that had watched him grow up and seen him try to murder his own mother. He couldn't face the reality of what he had become. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he moved to another state, that he found work doing manual labor, that he was living in a small apartment and struggling to make ends meet. I heard that Vanessa had abandoned him as soon as the money disappeared, that she had moved on to find other victims in other cities. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the house feels too empty, I light a candle and sit in my living room, thinking about the little boy he used to be, the child who used to fall asleep in my arms while I read him stories, the son who used to bring me flowers from the garden and tell me he loved me. And I whisper into the flickering flame, I forgive you. Not because he deserves it, not because what he did was understandable, or excusable, or forgivable, not because I think he's sorry, or that he's learned from his mistakes, or that he would make different choices if he had the chance to do it over again. I forgive him because I deserve peace, because carrying hatred and anger and bitterness would be like keeping the fire burning inside my own heart, because forgiveness isn't about him, it's about me and my right to be free from the poison of resentment. I forgive him because my mother taught me that fire only listens to those who respect it, and I have learned to respect even the fire that burns within families, even the fire that consumes trust and love and hope. Michael visits me every few months now. He's a good man, kind and generous, and nothing like his younger half-brother. He's married with 2 children of his own, and he's teaching them the same lessons about fire that my mother taught me all those years ago. We talk about James sometimes, sharing memories and stories that help us both understand the man we both loved in different ways. Michael tells me about his childhood with his father, about the early years before the divorce that tore their family apart. I tell him about the man James became later, about the husband and father he was during the years we shared together. Together, we're rebuilding something that Daniel's fire tried to destroy. Not a house. Houses can be replaced. We're rebuilding the idea of family. The idea that love and loyalty and trust can survive even the worst betrayals. The idea that truth, like fire, can be a force for creation as well as destruction. If this story has reached you, if these words have found their way to your heart, I want you to remember something important. Fire tests everything. It burns away what is fake and fragile and false, and it leaves only what is strong enough to survive. The people who love you, who really love you, will stand with you even when everything around you is burning. The people who only want what you can give them will walk away and lock the door behind them. Fire reveals truth, and truth, no matter how painful, no matter how devastating, is always better than living with lies. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that truth always wins, no matter how long it hides under the ashes. Share this story if you think people need to hear about the fires that reveal rather than destroy. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your own child set the fire? What would you have done if the person you loved most in the world tried to kill you for money? How do you forgive the unforgivable? How do you find peace after betrayal? How do you rebuild when everything you trusted has been burned to the ground? I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'd like to know that these words have reached people who understand that sometimes the worst fires lead to the most important truths. Because that's what this story is really about. Not revenge or justice or even survival. It's about the truth that burns brighter than any flame someone else can set. It's about the fire that reveals who people really are when they think no one is watching. And it's about the peace that comes when you finally stop trying to change people who have chosen to be something other than what you hoped they could become. Thank you for listening. Thank you for witnessing. Thank you for believing that truth matters, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts.